let's dive into your health-related resolutions for 2021. And again, tonight's topic is really predominantly related to stress. So what are we talking about here? Stress, the big year that we've had. Let's talk about the effects and the impacts of stress. Before we dive into what you can do about it, let's really talk about some of the components that happen as a result of chronic stress. Now, key word here being chronic stress, not acute, because acute stress is normal. Acute stress is healthy. For example, acute high-intensity interval training exercise is a form of acute stress, which can be very helpful and healthy to you. But we're talking about chronic stress because it's chronic stress that kills. So that being said, what is it that chronic stress does? Number one, it leads to weight gain. Now, how does it lead to weight gain? One of the components to chronic stress is it elevates a cortisol or hormone, okay, that helps our body deal with stress. Our adrenal glands are activated under chronic stress. So our adrenal glands are those glands that sit on top of your kidneys. You have two of them, one on each side, and when you're under chronic stress, you're going to produce more cortisol. Now, cortisol, again, it's the hormone that our body produces to help us deal with chronic stress. Unfortunately, long-term, chronic meaning elevations in stress over time and long-term elevations in cortisol. So this is we're not worried about an acute elevation in cortisol. It's a chronic elevation. It does several things. One, it reduces muscle. It causes your muscles to actually atrophy, shrinks your muscle. Now, we also know it reduces bone mass. So it can reduce your bone density. We know that chronic steroid use, as an example, when you use steroids to fight asthma or inflammation or other chronic inflammatory diseases, the side effects are muscle loss and loss of bone density, to name a few. But we get with this, with this elevation in cortisol, it also leads to an increase in blood sugar. Okay, right here, elevates blood sugar, and that elevation in blood sugar subsequently leads to an increase in insulin, which leads to insulin resistance, which leads to diabetes, right? Which leads to weight gain. So you can see this whole kind of scenario here, which is chronic stress, weight gain, vitamin and mineral depletion, elevates blood sugar, increases inflammation in the body. So even though we're making a hormone over time that reduces inflammation, chronically, stress causes an increase in inflammation. So when you're not really resolving the issue. So again, chronic stress is what we're after. So, fundamental question number one to ask yourself is, aside from what you can't control, we couldn't control the way our government handled the pandemic. We can't control the way the media is outright and frankly lying about the statistics revolving around this particular pandemic. But what we can control is our own personal choices and our own personal behaviors. And so this is what we want to focus our efforts and energy on, because the only way we can control the government is to come together as people and vote the right people in, and come together as people and petition the government with our grievances. But again, this is not a political show, so we're not going to dive too deep into that. We want to control the factors that we can control. And so that comes to, what is it that's creating your stress? So the first question that you want to ask in all this is, what is it that's stressing you out that you can control? And for most people, there are four primary areas that they're either neglecting, if you will, or that they're not giving enough attention to, or that they just don't know that need the attention. And those are the things that we want to really focus on tonight. So as it relates to those four areas, let's talk about area number one. Area number one is diet. Okay, most people, especially under chronic stress. Now, if you're like me, I grew up in a household where food was used to demonstrate love, right? Food equals love. And unfortunately, the household I grew up in, the food that was, being demonstrative of love was not necessarily healthy. And we celebrated with cakes and cookies and pies and things that, actually destroy health as opposed to create it or help to support it. And so many people have the same kind of families, and that, within our families, because we express love with food, and because stress causes an increases your craving for sugar. That's one of the other side effects that I didn't talk about a minute ago. So increasing cortisol increases sugar craving, which contributes to bad choices with food. Okay, so people generally tend to make worse choices within their diet. Under stress, they'll gravitate toward sugar, toward baked goods, toward foods that give them a sense of peace. And that's generally the foods you grew up with that are part of your family and part of your culture, that are what we call comfort foods, right? So again, for me, I grew up in a family where ice cream was the ultimate comfort food. And so, having to break that vicious cycle was something I had to really try to learn to do. But that cortisol increasing the sugar cravings, increasing your propensity toward bad choices. Now, sugar also creates a secondary problem for many people with a gluten sensitivity issue, and that's yeast overgrowth, candida, if you will. Now, problem with yeast overgrowth is that yeast mimics gluten. So if you have a yeast overgrowth in your small intestine because you're over consuming sugar, because you're stressed out and you're making bad diet choices, and that yeast overgrows, the yeast can produce a protein that mimic gluten. So if you're on a gluten-free diet and you're trying to follow the no grain, no pain protocol, this will derail that even if you're not eating grain, because again, yeast mimics gluten. So if you have a yeast overgrowth, the protein that yeast produces looks just like gluten to your immune system, and that can contribute to additional chronic inflammation and subsequent problems. So diet becomes very, very important, right? So recognizing what are the bad choices that you're making. That's step one. We always have to, start with progress by looking in the mirror, and you can't begin your 2021 to try to restore health if you're going to lie to yourself and not answer these difficult questions. So the first question you should be asking is, what is it that I'm currently doing within my diet that's contributing to poor health, as opposed to what is it that I could be doing or could be changing that might influence my health in a great direction. So diet, very, very critical. Now, what I've got over here are three primary triggers that we see time and again induce and create the most inflammation. So what are those triggers? Number one, gluten, but not just gluten, also grains. So if you're following that kind of traditional celiac, wheat, barley, rye free diet, but you're still eating oats, corn, rice, and other grains, you need to look toward getting rid of those, especially if you've got a diagnosis where a doctor has told you that you have celiac disease or gluten sensitivity, because these are going to be inflammatory triggers in a very big way. Casein, but more particularly the family of dairy. Now, I've done past videos in depth about dairy and why you want to avoid dairy, especially if you're new to the gluten-free diet, to avoid dairy for at least the first 6 months as a reset. But anyway, dairy is a big inflammatory food. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but most of you probably won't fit those exceptions. And if you want to learn more about those exceptions, I encourage you to go head on over to glutenfreesociety.org and check out our video blog over there, because I've done entire 2-hour shows on dairy and the whys, in essence, why we want to avoid a lot of our traditional modern dairies today. So don't have time to get into that tonight. The third is sugar. Sugar, as we were just mentioning, right? So part of sugar is processed sugar. I'm not talking about carbohydrates from healthy foods like fruit sugar. That's not at all what I'm discussing or talking about as being potentially detrimental, although some people overdo carbohydrates. I'm talking about crystallized processed sugar, either from cane or beet or corn, the stuff that's found in processed and packaged foods. This stuff is a big, big no-no. It's one of the most addictive substances known to man, and there are probably more research studies implicating the detriment of sugar on overall health. We know sugar causes chronic inflammation. We know it causes heart disease. We know it causes diabetes. We know it can contribute to weight gain and obesity and metabolic syndrome. We know it can contribute to cancer. We know sugar can contribute to bone loss. We know sugar can cause vitamin and mineral deficiencies. So this stuff is just not healthy. And again, many of you coming off the holiday season where you were probably hanging out with your family, and potentially, again, families celebrate And oftentimes they celebrate in a potentially detrimental way. So if you're trying to do that reset for this new year, this is one you definitely want to consider taking out. Now remember too what I said a minute ago, and that is that when you have chronic stress, that will elevate your natural production of cortisol, and cortisol increases blood sugar. So even if you're not eating sugar, you might still struggle with elevations in blood sugar, okay, if you don't alleviate the chronic stress. So that's why stress, then we look at stress, we call it one of the biggest killers for humans, for people, is because chronic stress has so many negative or detrimental hormonal-based side effects. One of them, of course, being that it elevates sugar, blood sugar specifically. So chronic stress increases blood sugar, because remember, your liver stores about 325 grams of glucose. So when you're under chronic stress, that cortisol taps into that liver storage and starts dumping what the liver is storing as sugar into your bloodstream. This is actually dumped into your bloodstream as glucose, right? There's this process biochemically that where stored glucose is broken down by your liver and dumped into your bloodstream, and your body doesn't really differentiate between stress-induced sugar dumping from your liver and the sugar that you might consume, let's say, in a bowl of ice cream or a candy bar, right? So that glucose hits your bloodstream the same way. Remember that glucose elevates blood viscosity. It makes the proteins in your blood sticky. It increases the thickness of your blood, which puts more pressure on your heart, can elevate blood sugar. There's a process with glucose called glycation. You might have heard of this before. Glycation is a biochemical process whereby glucose sugar coats substances in your bloodstream. So for example, hormones and carrier proteins. Basically, what happens if your blood sugar is on average too high, that sugar will attach to your hormones, your blood proteins, and make them sticky, and they won't work as well. So ladies, if you're struggling with what you feel like might be hormone problems, but you've had your hormone levels measured, your doctor says, oh, they look good, your levels are normal, but your blood sugar's on average higher than what it should be, it could be that your hormones are not working properly because they're glycated by that excessive sugar. So keep that in mind. You can have a normal hormone test result if your blood sugar averages are too high. This is one of the reasons why these are the 3 food groups that we want to avoid if we're just generalizing, because one of the reasons why we avoid these 3 is all 3 of these food groups elevate cortisol. Okay, they elevate cortisol because they're inflammatory. And anytime we eat foods that are inflammatory, we get that subsequent rise in blood sugar, subsequent glycation in our bloodstream. If your doctor ever ran a test on you called a hemoglobin A1C, what is that test measuring? It's measuring glycation. It's measuring how much glucose has attached to your hemoglobin, which is a protein in your blood and your blood cells, your red blood cells, that helps you carry oxygen. So this is a way doctors can measure averages of blood sugar over time, and that's called a hemoglobin A1C. Again, it's measuring the glycation, okay, or the sugar adhesion to your red blood cell hemoglobin. So the diet has to change first. Now, let me back up a minute. I would be remiss to say, look, if you're looking at making a big diet change for the new year and you don't know where to begin, the simplest place to start this process is no grain, no pain. Now, again, if you're new to the show, if you're new to Pick Dr. Osborne's Brain, No Grain, No Pain is my best-selling book. You can pick it up at Barnes & Noble. You can pick it up at Amazon and any major book retailer. But this book outlines a 30-day process for you to follow with diet change included that should help you overcome many of these diet triggers for chronic inflammation, which again will create that hormonal dysfunction and other problems. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.